everybody, and welcome to the Fungi Monkey podcast. And I'm here today with Victoria Colette Jones. She's at satoshipage.com, I believe. She's also an author of what's it called? Truth Decay: How Bitcoin Fixes This. I like the sound of that book. Thank you for coming on. I've got loads of questions, of course. Let's start off. I hear that you were born in Wales.
I was, yes.
Whereabout in Wales were you born?
Near Newport. So near
but
my grandparents came from North Wales. They came from like a little mining village. Off the top of my head, can't remember what it was, and they spoke fluent Welsh. So I've definitely got Welsh heritage on my father's side and Irish heritage on my mother's side. So I'm definitely Celtic.
Yeah,
I'm Celtic through and through.
I got exactly the same. Apart from the North Walian in South Wales, the racist among us call them gogs up north. Oh, them gogs, yeah. Oh, those pesky gogs. And Wales is obviously a very diverse place, but I've also got a bit of Irish that goes back probably. My great grandfather, my pa Lewis Vedmore, his father was from Northern Ireland. The family were from Northern Ireland. They were Orange Order. They were extremely strict Protestants who believed in like the Protestant Catholic like paradigm and all of that. So I think they may have escaped that and eventually ended up in Wales. And of course, a lot of the majority of my family are from South Wales. So, but I was interested to hear that you're for a Welsh girl, and I
am.
It's not so. It's not so rare nowadays. There's a few of them, you know. There's a few million Welsh girls around the place.
We get around.
Lovely girls they are too. Now I know a little bit about your background myself, but can you tell the people who will be watching a little bit about where you started off, when you first got into work? What did you work as? Because obviously you're a bit of a Bitcoin pioneer, you could say nowadays. You know, the people who were on the first wave of the Bitcoin and the people who understand it best are still the pioneers of this industry, this new sector that's growing, this cryptocurrency sector. But obviously Bitcoin's one of the most important. So what were you doing beforehand?
Well, I was actually a dentist. I was a dentist for 20 years. Hence the title of my book, Truth Decay. I know.
I see. Oh, that's clever, isn't it? That's clever. Truth Decay. I see. Yeah, I had I had extra teeth that came in over the top. So I had through my youth, I had teeth being pulled out, and it was a terrible old time. So you can imagine I was scared of people like you once upon a time, probably while you were a dentist.
Well, no, I mean, I can't say I blame you. I mean, the thing is, as a child, I kind of had this idea of what dentistry should be. And, you know, I was brought up to believe that, you know, the world was kind and wonderful and everyone did the right thing. And so I should do the right thing. And so, you know, I was still very naive as an 18-year-old, you know, going to university. And so, you know, I had this idea of how dentistry should act and operate. And, you know, my mother was always very scared of doctors. And I was quite fascinated by that because I was like, I didn't understand it. You know, logically to me, it was like doctors are caring people who want to look after you. And she'd had some terrible, I mean, I'm the eldest of 6 children. She'd had some terrible experiences with her babies. And this is one, you know, she wouldn't go near hospitals with a barge pole. And so I was quite fascinated by this. And for a while, I thought about doing medicine. But then as a teenager, there were loads of news reports about young doctors not getting enough sleep and stuff like that. And I was like, I like my sleep. I'm not, this is clearly not an option. So I went for dentistry instead. And again, you know, the only thing that I had to measure what a dentist did was the dentist that I went to see myself, who was a very nice lady working in the community dental service. I never had particular problems with teeth myself. So I didn't really fully understand what it constituted. And it was only once, you know, you kind of enter a profession and you see what it's really, really all about. And so, you know, I think I strove during the 20 years of my career to kind of get to where I felt it should be. But in the process of doing that, you know, I came across all of the obstacles in the way. So one of the biggest debates in dentistry or medicine at the moment is like the more dentistry, actually, because there's less chance to do it in the UK with medicine. But the big debate between NHS and private sector, and, you know, how that came about. I mean, I started my career just as they reduced the payments that the government were going to give dentists for NHS pay. And so that was when the private sector dentistry in the UK really started to take off. And so there was a lot of debate around the ethics of that. You know, there were some dentists who, you know, just thought you were a completely bad person if you decided to go and work in the private sector. It was like your moral duty to work in the NHS sector. But at the same time, you know, if they're reducing the resources for the NHS to work as it should, you know, how is that ethical either? So there were lots of debates around that, and I found that particularly interesting. And so, you know, just in the process of trying to kind of reconcile, you know, well, what is the right thing here and what is best for my patients? It meant that I had to do quite a deep dive into how politics works and how finance works. And actually being a dentist, once I became one, I was like, not sure I would particularly like this job. I mean, I made the best of it because I didn't have many options. I mean, I graduated in so much debt. It was literally the only job I could do to get myself out of debt. So I kind of had to work with it, but I was always... I didn't particularly like it, but I did find the politics and the business aspects, I found those quite intriguing. And so I studied for an MBA thinking that I might, you know, go down a different career path. But at the same time, I was quite aware of the fact that a lot of dentists are kind of trained to be dentists. They're not trained to be business people and to actually, you know, have successful businesses. So I did that. And then I'd worked for a number of corporates that were trying to do better with the business dentistry model. And I just, you know, some of the things they did didn't make sense to me either. So I was like, okay, fine. The only way to do this is to try and do it myself. And so I decided to set up my own little practice from scratch. I didn't want an NHS contract, so I just wanted to do it privately so that I could see each patient and see them fresh and be really clear about what was on offer and what was expected from the patients in return right from the beginning. But as it turns out, that was the most difficult way in order to run a dental practice. And of course, I tried that just as the financial crisis hit in 2008. Anyway, so long story short, that even though I'd done the MBA, what that made me realize was there's stuff about finance, even more about finance, that I don't understand. And so when I finally got beyond the financial crisis bit, which made my life very, very difficult for a long time, it was like I really wanted to understand what was going on. And also for most of my life, up until the middle part of my business where it started to take off, I'd always kind of relied on debt. I'd never actually been in a situation where I had money that I could save. And so finally, when my business got to the stage where it was making some money, I finally managed to sell a house, because I tried starting to sell that in 2007. Worst time ever to sell a house, apart from maybe now, but that's a whole other subject. You know, it took me 7 years to sell it. So when I finally sold that and my business was taking off and I finally had some money, it was just like, well, what do I actually do with it in order to save it and make sure it's safe? Because I remembered from the time when I was a child, you know, you go to the post office and you get 10% on your savings. But, you know, by 2015, you were lucky if you got 0.01% on your savings. So it was like, I don't understand what happened here. And so that, you know, I really wanted to understand, because I was just like, if I'm going to hold on to this money, I want to know it's in the safest place possible. And so that was kind of the beginning of my journey. And it was in the process of doing a deep dive into that I started to learn about sound money and how, you know, our financial system used to work on gold and silver.
Before we get into that, I'll say a couple of things, because there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot you've said there to unpack, especially around something simple like the politics of dentistry, especially in the UK. The first thing I thought, to be honest, when you started speaking was, I remember my first crush was on a dentist. I must have been about 4 years old, and I remember she was angelic and blonde. And my sister was in the chair one time, and I was I was staring at this beautiful dentist lady, and I was slowly moving forward, and we were on this little wooden bench that was in the dentist in the dental room, and yeah, just as I was leaning forward, looking at her, and I just fell flat on my face. Yeah, and I completely loved her. I thought she was beautiful. But I had I told you just before we came on, I had lots of issues with teeth, because I had teeth that grew. My whole family had issues. My dad and one of my sisters only have their baby teeth. They never had a second set of teeth come through, which may seem like a fairly, like something you've come across before, but most people haven't heard of it. Most people go, "What?" And me and my
rare.
Yeah. Me and my other sister, we had multiple teeth. So I had like 8 teeth pulled out to have drops. So I had like shark teeth, you could say. And I had loads of issues. I had to have braces and stuff. And I was, of course, stuck in the NHS system. My family were relatively poor. When I was growing up, my mum was washing test tubes in Heath Hospital in Cardiff. That was a part-time work that she could get. And my dad was a steel worker. So he was also a bit of a flirt and out with the ladies all of the time, behind the scenes. So he was spending all of his money elsewhere. So we were, we didn't have the option for things like private dentistry. And as I got older, this system, this NHS system, became more and more. It was crushing the dentistry practices, obviously, because it was suddenly like I could only have I'd need 3 fillings, and I could only afford to have one this year on their the budget that the NHS set. So they were obviously pushing down. And for a lot of people, because a lot of people within my audience will be American, will be from abroad, so they have no idea of what the NHS is like and what that sort of system does, because what that system does is mean that everything's about saving money all of the time rather than the best practice for the patient, both in hospitals and in areas like dentistry. So I can imagine that would be a massive eye-opener. It's really interesting to hear your journey led you to be like, well, I got to understand finance if I want to enter into private dental care, and then to find out that they don't, they probably make it very hard for private practices to run in comparison to NHS practices. But even so, everything is red tape, lots of paperwork and stuff like this, I'm sure. So
the way I summarize it when I tend to talk to people is, what a lot of people don't realize is that the NHS is effectively a monopoly. And so when it comes to economics, that has huge implications in a free market, because you haven't got fair competition.
Yeah, and when you're talking about, you talked earlier about the dentists would look down upon people who went to go private. I mean, that wasn't just dentists, was it? That's in the whole of the British society. There's the NHS is like this beacon of virtue that cannot be questioned. Yeah, and it's scary. It's scary because I used to. I used to say to people, the NHS saved my life. I had something called Graves' disease. I had it was a really severe thyroid disease. I went down to 8.5 stone and I was dying. But I went down to 8.5 stone and I was dying because every time I went to the doctors, they told me everything was fine. They told me it was normal. All of the different symptoms that I had were completely normal, when it obviously wasn't. And I know it wasn't now, but they were just trying to save money. And they saved money at the expenses of people's lives and people's health. And that's so anti-virtue. There's no virtue attached within there. So there was this false paradigm that everybody gets brainwashed with in Britain. The NHS is the most important thing. The NHS is the most important thing. And of course, over the past 2 years, we've seen where that leads to. We've seen to the people who aren't allowed to see their relatives while they're dying, while the nurses are dancing in the corridor on TikTok, and everybody's still going, oh, they're so wonderful. And it's really hard, and really, from someone who I saw the same thing happen to my nan. who also had a thyroid disease and eventually died because they didn't treat her properly. And she had no help with my granddad, who was also, couldn't walk anymore. And she was a little old woman, she's having to lift this massive guy all the time. And it drove her to death in the end. So I've seen how the NHS leave people die constantly, leave people in situations where they want to do good for the patients, because I'm sure, like you say, you went into private because you had to, it was the only way to give good service to a patient. And it was only I think last year where I first went to a private dentistry, to a private dentist, and wow, the difference was amazing. My experience was just like, the guy sorted everything out. They talked through everything. They were kind, they were patient. I thought they would be just after my money, but they weren't just after my money. They were after giving me a really good service, and that service does cost some money, but it's worth it. Then it's worth the money. So I just wanted to cover in on that. You got to the 2008 financial crisis. And
yeah, well, I mean, if I could just, I'll just kind of close the circle on the whole NHS thing. The reason why a lot of people get really confused about stuff like this is that a lot of these things start off as something that's really good. Because the NHS started in the 1940s, and it was like the reward to all the soldiers that had fought in the World War. It was in some respects, it was one of the only ways they could actually get the soldiers to fight in the Second World War, because the First World War had been so horrendous. Most people didn't want to touch it with a barge pole.
Of course, so lots of people came back after gas attacks and stuff like this with the worst type of lungs. I mean, World War I was terrible for mustard gas and the like. Sorry, go on.
Exactly. And up until that point in time, healthcare was very different. I mean, I was talking to someone else on a podcast recently where they were mentioning that every woman of a certain generation, they had all their teeth extracted when they were 21 and had them replaced with dentures, purely because it was a way of saving their husband costs for their dental treatment as they got older. And that was a standard thing. I mean, both grandmothers in my family had all of their teeth removed, and for those reasons, really barbaric if you think about it. But the thing is, they didn't really have any other options. There was a limit to how far the profession could progress scientifically, because in some respects you needed an injection of funding in order to kind of get that explosion of knowledge. And in some respects, the fact that the NHS was created facilitated that to a certain degree. Yeah. But again, this ties in with how the financial system works, because a lot of people don't realize that, one of the things that kind of restricted our financial system and kept a limit on the costs of things was the fact that our money used to be based on a gold standard. And of course, that broke after the First World War. And although those rules were kind of bent in order to fund the First World War, and there was a lot of political debate about that at the beginning of the last century. But one of the side benefits of that was, people argued, well, if we can create all this money for war, how come we can't create all of this money in order to help poor people and help provide, free services? And so in some respects, the NHS came about because it was like trying to put a positive spin on something that had already been tampered with. And a lot of people remark on the fact that we seem to have had this explosion of growth and technology in the 20th century. But of course, this is all related to how our money has been messed with. And it's a really tricky thing for people to kind of get their heads around, because although we're now starting to see the worst consequences of that, for the middle part of the 20th century, some people really benefited. In fact, it was our grandparents who benefited the most, and they had no idea at the time of the legacy that they were kind of leaving their grandchildren.
Yeah.
Occasionally.
I mean, I did a just before you go to, because keep that and what you're going to say next in mind. One of the first times that my eyes were opened to what the NHS where it really came from and the problems within it was I was researching probably my second article, which went really viral. It was just before Theresa May was elected as prime minister, the official election rather than just installed into power. And I did a load of research on a family history because no one else was going there, and I thought that's really interesting. Her father was a priest. I'd like to know more about it. And I went back and discovered that he worked as a chaplain in Eastbourne Hospital during the time that John Bodkin Adams was murdering his patients and having them sign them into his will. And he was the chaplain. He would have been giving the last rites to patients. He would have been co-signing the death certificates and stuff. And Dr. John Bodkin Adams killed over 130 people as an official NHS doctor, and they covered it up. He got off with it. He got done for like a slap on the wrist. Got done for forging some prescriptions. No murder charges at all. Later on, he would go back and practice as a doctor again, and that was because they were so terrified that it would see the fall of the NHS nearly as soon as it was built. Because this was as soon as it was built, just like within 10 years after it was built. This was 1955 5 times. So they were trying to make this NHS's virtuous wonderland, but behind the scenes, people were taking advantage all over the place.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And a lot of that was, of course, down to money and poverty, because during this period, what lots of people don't realize, especially over in America, is that America, where they lost a lot of lives during the war, Britain not only lost lives, but they lost livelihoods, they lost their houses, they lost businesses, whole entire areas were bombed completely during the war and were devastated. So there was a lot of loss during that period, and there was a lot of rebuilding afterwards, and that brought a lot of money that came from the government, managed to be shoveled through into all of these public enterprises that were really ways to make money. And just after that period, you have the building of all of the housing that would later, within 10 years, fall down and be pulled down because it was so badly made. It was just a way for people to grab this public money, and that's a lot of what we get. So that public money is just like, as soon as you offer something to the public, you have the people just above the poor people and just below the super rich, who are all trying to grab all of that money like it's a episode of the Crystal Maze and they're in the dome. Go on.
Absolutely. So, and that's often how they trick the public, because they introduce something as it being a benefit, but you don't know what the bad side is. And that there are many subjects I'm sure we can talk about along those lines. It's how they get you every single time. And the NHS is just an amazing example, because of course people are very afraid of being in a situation where, a health event, you can have your whole life planned out, and then something like a health event can completely disrupt your life. Now, I know they suffer from this terribly in America, and for all the things that are bad about the NHS, one of the things is it does give you that psychological safety net where it's not something that you ever have to worry about in Britain.
Yeah.
If you do end up having to go there are all sorts of other issues in terms of the quality of the service that you get. But for the most part, if you're able to keep yourself healthy and away from it, you don't have to worry about it. And hopefully in a situation where you are in a bad accident, someone's not going to come along and give you $100,000 credit card bill.
I can hear 1,000 Americans in my head right now laughing at the idea of Americans keeping themselves healthy. But yeah, go on. Sorry, continue.
Well, I mean, again, what is healthy? I mean, so much of it is subject to propaganda. I mean, again, in the UK, you don't have marketing campaigns for drugs, but I know in America you get marketing campaigns for drugs all the time. And of course, if someone's not particularly well educated about these things, it's very easy to be kind of taking one drug after another. They all interact with each other. The moment you take one drug, it starts to mess with your biochemistry. By the time you're taking 10, goodness knows, what's going on. But of course, it seems like a simple solution to solve a problem, when often it can be more complex. A lot of health, I'd say the majority of health issues are down to your diet, the way you exercise. And stress plays a big part in a lot of illnesses as well.
You're obviously very you're very good at educating yourself, and there's a lot of people out there who aren't very good at educating themselves. A lot of people who need help, and it's only been recently in modern history, due to the internet, that people have really had the resources to be able to help themselves. But even now, loads of people don't. They do, the fear. So how do you what is it, something inside you that always wants to know for sure what the next step is? Is that what you've gone? Because by the sounds of it, you've educated yourself before you've entered into most things.
Pretty much. I mean, the whole time I was growing up, my mother was always skeptical about everything. So I mean, as I've already mentioned, she was particularly scared of doctors, and so she would, anything they say, she would challenge. And even though she was mostly a housewife when we were little, I mean, she ended up going on to be a counselor. She was always naturally a bit of a contrarian. That's what you'd kind of call them now. And I wouldn't say she was like tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, because that's like really heavy duty, but she'd always question things, and she'd go, that's not right, or that's not logical. And I think her mother did it as well. I'd say my father's parents are much more likely to kind of follow the party line, but my mother was always someone who kind of questioned things. And I think because of that, she always taught us to think and to question. I mean, it never went so far that I believe the world was a frightening or scary place, but she'd always kind of question things, and so
now you've educated yourself. Do you see the world as a frightening, scary place?
Well, I mean, like you mentioned before about, your Irish heritage being Protestant, my Irish heritage was Catholic.
No, sorry, that's my great granddad inside me. Even my dad. I mean, that got passed down. I remember finding, and I for all of his bad bits, I don't mind embarrassing him a bit. But my dad, I remember finding a school photo of his in the photo album. Of course, our generation had massive photo albums of all of the family that you get saved, and every 6 months or so you go through and you look at all of the wonderful
we've got
pictures.
those.
And just physical stuff. It's just so, it's the smell. I can even smell, I can feel it, I can hear the crispy pages of those plastic sheeting that protects stuff over the top, and it's beautiful. But I remember finding this a picture from his school where he's lined up with all his school friends, and I remember thinking, I want to look at the back, and I opened up the page, I turned it around, and written on the back was, in really like young writing, in obviously written when he's a kid, "I hate Catholics."
Oh dear.
I know. And for me, I was a kid, and I was just like, I didn't understand it. We had been brought up with that sort of, with religion around. I was brought up in a church, and when I reached 11, I was just like, I was the first one in my family to say, okay, I don't want to go to church anymore because I don't see the point of it. And my dad went for 2 weeks afterwards, and then everybody stopped going. Just like before that, we were all suited and booted every Sunday school all of the time. But I was just like, I'm not doing it anymore. This is rubbish. And the whole family just stopped, because it had just been this process that they had gone through. They weren't really religious. They weren't looking. And I found that a lot of that took away. But that, I mean, for a lot of people who don't understand you from the States, you're from an Irish Catholic background. And in my background, I've got Protestant Irish in my background, and so my great grandfather, great grandfather maybe, was part of the Orange Order, which is a serious bunch of people who really heavily believe in stuff and do the obviously the Orange March through Belfast every year, and it used to be just riots galore back when I was growing up, and so I think that was part of the thing as well, seeing the because Ted Heath government government put British rule over Northern Ireland, and of course then you had all of the flare up of the IRA, and it turned really militant. And then of course I think they were supplying them with guns as well at the same time, so that they could make sure there was problems in there. So historically, if we had been 100 years ago, me and you might not have been allowed to speak. So the world has changed massively. You know, the world has changed massively. So go on.
Well, it has done. I mean, you know, Irish Catholic was in my heritage, but of course I grew up in England. So
never know. Not England. No, sorry, I can't help it.
Yeah. So although, you know, the strong Protestant background was more English based, you know, I was kind of, you know, I suppose, you know, my belief system might have been a bit of a fish out of water, but I never kind of went to church and was really aware of the political issue the whole time I was growing up. I mean, I'd hear of stuff going on in Northern Ireland, but it didn't really affect me on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I went to a Catholic school, so I was surrounded by other people who saw things the same way, but the focus was much more kind of on the religion and the morality and, you know, kind of giving you a moral structure. And so going back to the previous question you asked about seeing the world as a bad place, I mean, you kind of grow up with this religion of, you know, well, there's evil in the world. And it was like, well, what is this evil? You know, sometimes people would be horrible to me, but, you know, is that evil? It's not like they were murdering me. And so I was kind of a bit confused by that. And in many respects, you know, I kind of grew up with, I mean, in some people would say it was a harsh background, but compared to some people in the world, it was a very privileged background. And, you know, generally speaking, you know, my parents, you know, kept me safe and well fed, and there was a roof over my head, and I wasn't living in an environment where people were shooting each other all the time. And so I grew up in a fairly safe and protected environment. And of course, it's only when you grow up and you start paying more attention to the news. So I wasn't interested in the news as a kid, but when you start understanding what's going on abroad, and it's only when I started traveling abroad. I mean, we went on holiday to Cyprus, and we decided to do a day trip to Egypt. And on the way to Egypt, you know, we had an armed guard at the back of the coach, and it was just like, really? Why do we need that? It was just like, my mind was completely blown. And the other thing that at the time when I visited Egypt is like, you had all these buildings with metal posts poking out the top. And I was like, what's all that about? You know, the city looks a mess. And basically it was because, you know, as the family group, they kind of added a new you know, then they built the walls in order to add a new generation, and so these metal spikes were to allow them to kind of keep building these buildings up, but they didn't actually build them until they needed them, because otherwise the government taxed them. And so realizing that it was the tax that was actually influencing this outcome, you know, was a real revelation to me, because those are things that, you know, aren't commonly talked about on the news or media or the internet even now.
That exists in where I am now in Chile. That exists today, where the building regulations, the building laws mean that people buy their little parcella of land, they start building their property, but they purposely don't finish their property because otherwise they'd have to pay tax.
Yeah, exactly. But what that means is you end up in a city that looks a mess. So, you know, and so it's only when you kind of go to a place like this and you say, why is it like that? And you realize that it comes down to law, politics, finance. And you start to realize how it's all of these rules and regulations that rule the world. I mean, so going back to dentistry, you know, I qualified as a dentist, you know, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about to, you know, wanting to do the best for my patients. But you know, the moment I qualified, end up in this system that won't let me do that. And so, again, this is one of the things that led me to do this MBA. It was because it's clearly the system that's creating a problem rather than the fact that there are good people wanting to do the right thing. Because even if you're a good person wanting to do the right thing, if you're in a system that won't let you, unless you've got a hell of a lot of courage and resources, it's really, really difficult to follow that. And so what tends to happen over a period of time is that people just give up. They're just kind of like, well, you know, it's the lesser of two evils. I don't have the power to fight this myself, so I'm just going to let it ride. And so what happens is things that seem like a small issue at the beginning eventually become a bigger issue later on down the line. And so you kind of have like big evils like someone murdering someone or, you know, a nuclear war or whatever, but you also have the small evils, which are quite insidious, and they're about the fact that no one says anything and people kind of lets it keep going, and they don't challenge it, or they don't challenge it enough, or they don't think that it's important enough to challenge because they don't understand the significance of it. And when you realize that these systems have been designed by somebody, and somebody who may well have higher knowledge and wants to skew it more down the negative side rather than the good side, that's when your eyes really start to open. And the thing that really opened my eyes to this, believe it or not, was dentistry. Because when I opened my business, because I was starting from scratch, and I was, the idea was that I wanted to provide the best for my patients, but because of the environments I'd been working in, my skills were quite limited because I hadn't had the freedom to really develop them in the way I wanted to. So my business was also an opportunity for me to kind of develop my skills based on what my patients needed. And because I wasn't offering an NHS contract, I tended to attract patients that couldn't be helped by anybody else. And so what this means is it led to a number of challenges, because it was just like, well, why has someone got this problem that they've had for 20 years and that no one's fixed it? And so I started doing these different courses in order to learn about different aspects of dentistry. And what you start to come across is people who kind of see things differently to how you've been taught in the mainstream. And actually, what then tends to happen is just like, actually, some of these alternative perspectives make way more sense than what I was taught as a student. But the trouble is, the moment you try and introduce some of those alternatives as a benefit for your patients, you're then constrained by the fact that the entire legal system is structured around the fact that you need to do it the way in which the mainstream teaches it. And all of the specialists would lose their licenses and their insurances if they started doing it in a way that was different to what the mainstream teaches you.
When the mainstream wants to change things, suddenly everybody just has to flip and do whatever they say, whether or not it's actually going to be good for you or your customers or your potential patients.
And sometimes it's even not a case of the fact that they say it one night and then everyone changes the next day. It's a kind of an insidious thing that takes place over a period of time, and it's like one little argument that, if you have higher knowledge of the situation, you realize how that one decision is going to take you down a very dark road. But unless you've got someone challenging it with higher knowledge, wanting it to go down the good path, and they're strong enough to fight that argument, you end up getting the bad path by default. And so what you often find is that, these people who maybe are in secret societies, who've been keeping certain knowledge hidden for a long period of time, they have access to the bigger picture, but they're also some of them motivated to kind of take you down the dark path rather than the good path.
Many of those are constrained by the people who are surrounding them.
Exactly. So even if they wanted to do something differently, they couldn't, because they've already made a pledge to follow whatever this system says, regardless of what someone's conscience says. And so you start to realize that the whole thing is much more convoluted. Good and evil sounds very black and white, but actually I think there are a lot of good people who end up doing bad things, not because they deliberately wanted to. In fact, in their heart, they would never go down that path, but they kind of end up in a situation where they kind of have no choice, which is really difficult for them, because either you kind of switch off to the fact that your heart is saying one thing, but your head is just like, well, I've kind of got to take a head over heart decision here. And it's those head over heart decisions that even good people make that kind of take you down that pathway. It's like the saying that, bad things happen when good people say nothing. But sometimes good people saying something has so many consequences that they kind of have to not say anything anyway. And so there are lots of different elements that kind of feed into this that I think make it really difficult.
Most definitely. And we've seen a lot of this again play out over the past few years. And I think a lot of people who weren't aware of that in everyday life, once it hits them in a real level, like it's done through COVID, they're able to then wake up to it in other parts of their life, because it is everywhere. I do think there's a battle in society between rich and poor, but the main battle that really exists is always between good and evil. People who are willing to do bad, take advantage, people who want to do good. And a lot of the people who want to do good are often constrained and forced into a bad path by these bad people who build the surroundings, build the paradigm up around them. One of the things I really want to ask is, you did an MBA, which what does that mean
sorry.
to Americans? To Americans, what is an MBA?
Well, a lot of Americans will know what an MBA is because actually it's more popular in America than it is in England. So it's a Master's in Business Administration. So it's a degree that, people often take on the corporate ladder in order to be part of the hierarchy in a corporation.
How did you go through that? Did you do like a part-time course in university, or did you like go and just like spend a proper full-time like year or two in university to get into that?
Well, by the time I decided to do it, I was based in Nottingham, and Nottingham's got one of the best business schools in the country. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. And my father had an MBA, my sister had a degree in business, and I enjoyed some of the discussions that I had with them. So they had lots of different ways that you could do it. So for the first year, it was just 1 day a week. So it was split into modules. So there were 12 different modules that you could study, and there were some, I think there were about 5 that were mandatory, and then the rest you could kind of choose yourself. So I chose the first 2 that just worked with the lectures that were given on a Monday. So I went every Monday for a year. And then after that, you could study a module in a week, and then you'd have coursework and an exam that would go with that. So you end up studying it's like a combination of like 12 different subjects. So there was a whole module on economics, which was fascinating to me because as a dentist, I was never given any grounding in economics. There was also another one in law, which was really useful because I think a lot of people feel quite intimidated when it comes to the law, not understanding it. So just having that week's module where it kind of teaches you about what the law is about and how it works, that really helps.
Once you understand the law, you're suddenly confident in a completely different way. I was able to tackle a lot of the inappropriate behavior from doctors by going out to Waterstones and buying the full medical ethics and law book that you get for studying, with all the NHS constitution, a lot of case law in it, and reading that meant that I was so angry. I was so angry. Instead of being taken advantage of all of the time and feeling like I had no recourse, I suddenly wrote a letter that was 4 pages long and scared the hell out of the doctors, the GPs I was at, so much that they actually went and did all of the things that I needed them to do. Knowledge is power. You say that to people and it seems like such a line, just a one-liner that you say that there's nothing. But it's so true. Knowledge is power. You learn about the law and you go and you tackle the people, and the people crumble in front of you because the people you usually tackling don't know anything about the law, so they are unaware of it until they suddenly have it written down in front of them, go check it, discover it's real, go to their legal advisors, and it costs them money to do that, and then they're like, oh, we shouldn't have done this in the first place, and then that educates them, then it stops them going. So now I know that in Britain, which I'm not in Britain, I'm in Chile at the moment, but and it's a whole different kettle of fish over here, I can tell you that, but over there, I'm pretty positive my records with the GPs means that they want to make sure that they do exactly what's best for me straight away. No arguments, 0 arguments at all, because they are petrified at discovering information and having their, again, paradigm broken. And it's something that comes. So you learned about law as well, you were saying. Go on.
Yeah, so and you're absolutely right. Medics and dentists are given very little background in law. So just that week's course, empowered me enormously. I also did another module in accounting and finance. And, so something like this degree, what it enables you to do is it enables you to manage other professionals, because what happens is it's very easy for us to kind of be blindsided by other professionals who seem to have their own knowledge base, because each profession has its own language and its own words, and unless you understand the words and you understand the language, it's very difficult to know what you're dealing with sometimes. So it's very easy, to be working with a lawyer who decides to flummox you. And it's just like, hang on a minute, I know what you're trying to say here. And same with my accountant. If my accountant is trying to pull hang on a minute, that's not right. I mean, I've had to challenge accountants in my career. So, it's a very empowering degree, actually, because it kind of gives you a taste of all of the different professions
of the dark side. It gives you a taste of the dark side of
not
business.
not completely, because that's part of the problem. You kind of get partial information. You get enough information to empower you against what most people don't know, because they say, in order to be successful, you don't need to be 100% better than someone else. Just being 1% better than someone else will give you an edge.
Yeah.
And so, having access to this information empowers you. So some of the other subjects, so I studied marketing. The one thing marketing taught me was how easy it is to spend money and not get a result.
Yeah.
So that was very useful from a business perspective. They also did one on personal development, which is a bit like counseling and therapy and those sorts of issues. I did one, and I think I did customer service software. So that was how companies actually use customer information in order to manage the relationship they have with their customers. So different things like that, really. So it was very, very interesting. And although I could have used that degree, because at the time I was working at Boots head office, because I was at the time Boots had a chain of dental practices, and I'd managed to get a job helping them manage their complaints at head office. And they decided that they weren't going to do dentistry anymore, and they were going to close their business. And so I was given an opportunity to apply for a job elsewhere in the business, because I was already in the business, and I could have used my MBA maybe to do that. And so it was an opportunity. That was a golden opportunity, actually. I only really thought about in hindsight where I could have changed my career direction. But deep down, I felt I hadn't fully worked through what I wanted to achieve in dentistry. So I didn't make that choice. I ended up going to work with the business that bought out Boots. And I worked as one of their regional clinical directors, looking after a number of practices. So I'd go to their practices once a month and see what was happening with the dentist. I'd do interviews for new clinicians, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So my career as a dentist gave me a wide range of experiences, and this MBA also gave me a certain level of knowledge, and certainly an opportunity to kind of see things from a different perspective. And just realizing that there's a different perspective, even without kind of being a conspiracy theorist or going too deep down those rabbit holes, just realizing where some of the discrepancies are. It's just like, hang on a minute, and realizing how rarely some of these anomalies are challenged, I think was really useful education.
So, just to ask about the classic gender roles, male and female, that's all I stick with. You, at this time, you're talking, what year is this about?
So that was around 2004, 2005.
So were you a young mother at this point? Were you had you started a family yet or anything like that?
No, I hadn't had a family at that point. And to be honest, if I had, it wouldn't have been possible for me to do that job, because it involved quite a lot of traveling.
See, this is one of the things I'm very interested in, because the female business development is obviously different than male business development in this regard, and it's you've got to be a pioneer in more than one way if you're a woman doing all of this as well. So that must have been pretty much a hard job. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
Well, to be honest, the regional clinical directors, it was interesting actually. When I worked for Boots, most of the regional clinical directors were men, but when the business was taken over by Optical Express, the dental clinic, most of the regional clinical directors became women. Mostly because the men had resigned in protest.
Yeah.
And it was only the women who were keen to kind of have that opportunity. And gradually, one by one, we all kind of, there were many issues with that takeover, but it was a golden opportunity. It was a golden opportunity for the experience, just to kind of watch to be in head office and watch them make the decision not to do dentistry anymore, and then with the new business deciding to take over and the decisions they made. So, really useful insights. And of course, as someone on the ground looking from the outside into these corporations, you think that they've got everything sorted, but of course, working on the inside, you realize what they're up against and the mistakes they make at the same time. So very, very useful, interesting experience.
And this, I mean, you're heading towards the Bitcoin revolution beginning. When did you start branching out from dentistry? You got a bit of a training in business and management administration. You're understanding the financial stuff. When was it that everything started to change for you?
Well, I mean, I felt like I'd exhausted my options working for other people. So 10 years into my career, I was like, I'm done. I've seen what everyone else has to offer. I'm not that impressed. I can do it better myself. And so that was the point at which I decided to start my own business. And of course, it's, by then I'd kind of resolved the NHS private question. I had quite a bit of experience as an actual dentist. So I felt like I had enough of a skill set, and also with my MBA, I felt I had enough of a skill set in order to start my own business. But of course, what I hadn't factored in was, although I had some extra knowledge in terms of how finance worked, what I didn't have was an overview of the greater financial system. And that hit me really hard because I was trying to start my first business just as the financial crisis hit. And the way that manifested was that, I started off with a business plan based on how I'd earned money working for other people. I worked on the basis that I would continue in that vein. I'd never had a problem borrowing money. So I was just like, well, I've got some savings. I'll use some loans to start the business, buy the equipment, buy the materials. I've got this cash flow. I allowed for the fact that it would take a while to build up my list. So I didn't expect to be at full capacity straight away, but I had a trajectory. And so what happened with the financial crisis is that I started my business in December 2007. And I also had my first baby in February 2008, which I didn't anticipate being a problem because I always knew that it would take time to build the business. So if I started early or finished late, it meant that I could drop her off or pick her up later from nursery. So from a time perspective, I didn't anticipate that being a problem. But what I hadn't anticipated was, how much money I would need to get it off the ground. And the fact that, so the financial crisis slowed down how quickly I was able to get the business off the ground. And 9 months in, even though I had these loans and the payments were starting to kick in and I had some savings, I'd run through all of that. And so it was the point at which I needed a loan from the bank. And of course, September 2008, no bank on the planet was lending money to anybody. So, and that was a huge shock. I'd never had that before. I mean, I went into Lloyd's Bank and I was like, I need a loan. I was like, not my problem. It's like, but I have no money. Not my problem. And I'd never really in my career, I'd never faced that before. Normally banks throw money at dentists, but not then. So that was a real shock. The only reason I was able to keep my business going was because I was able to pay for my expenses using my credit cards. So I only had those because I'd applied for them long before that. I mean, I never really had a credit card before 2007, but, I was being sent these offers in the post. And so, I just kind of took them on, never anticipating that I'd need them. But, because I had big credit limits on them, it was those credit cards that kept my business going. But there were at least 3 occasions where something had gone wrong with the procedure I was doing for a patient and they hadn't been able to pay me that day. I'd have been bankrupt the following week. And so, the pressure, I mean, you want to get things right for your patient, but there was no leeway. There was no case of, okay, it's not quite right, we'll work on it again next time and come back. It's like, no, I have to get this right now because I need them to pay when they leave.
And you got a little baby as well. I mean, you got a little child around. That must have been devastating. I can't even imagine the fear that goes through you. Well, I kind of can because I got a baby now, and like the whole idea of what you do and where you need to be in the future does shift during that period. So yeah. And the sleepless nights as well. God, I mean, on top of that, it
was very stressful. Yeah, it really was. but of course also a powerful motivator, because up until that point I was fairly complacent about finance. I was like, this is how it worked. Dentists most of the time never need to really worry about money coming in. I'd chosen a profession and worked hard at it so that I never really had to worry about anything like that. So to find myself in a situation where I was worried about being able to pay for my groceries when I went to the supermarket, given that I'd spent 5 years at university qualifying to be a dentist, I was like, this is ridiculous. What's gone wrong? And even during the pandemic, I heard of dentists who were having to go to food banks, so the fact that society's got to this level is just horrifying. Anyway, I digress.
No, you don't digress, because we're on that path, because there needs to be solutions to this manipulated system that works only for the top, and where the Pareto distribution and all of the wealth keeps moving upwards and doesn't stop moving upwards. And at some point they can only squeeze a certain amount out of us before people are on the streets homeless. And I started to see a peak of it probably about 8 years ago, or peak of it, or the start of the peak, about 8 years ago in Cardiff, where you started to see that people were sleeping in the parks rough, and you started having conversations with people who were homeless, and they were people who had careers before, who had all the possibility to be able to get a job, but they had now no address. They were living amongst homeless people. They were looking for a way to crush that pain inside them, and of course that leads to other things, often alcohol and drugs.
It's absolutely terrible, the way people's lives are being destroyed, and especially when they've been told that this is what they need to do to be successful. So they've done everything right, and they still find themselves in these situations. It's devastating.
Walk the line and they lead you over a cliff. So
absolutely,
it's a real dangerous thing. So when did your world start changing? When did it? What year really was the point where you start to realize there's other options in the world?
So it was 2015 that I finally sold the house. I hadn't been able to sell for 7 years. And so that was when I finally had money that I needed to save somewhere. And so that's when I really started to research, because this was really precious to me, even as a professional. Having been through a situation where I was like, if I'm really stuck, even the bank might not be able to help me. So I need to figure out a way to put myself in a different situation, because I never, ever want to be in this situation ever again. And so, that's when I started doing a deep dive on, what is money? What is sound money? Like I say, I learned about what sound money was and how the world's financial system used to work on gold and silver. But having been a business owner, I realized that, even just accepting cash is a real pain, because, you've got to collect it and take it to a bank, and it's just an extra hassle. It's just easier if you accept a card payment. But one of the issues with card payments is that every card payment you take, they take like 1 or 2%, which doesn't sound a lot, but actually when you analyze business finances, there's a huge difference between taking 1 or 2% profit and 1 or 2%.
Well, when you got
top line,
when you cut costs, etc. I understand
exactly. And with a dental practice, your capital costs are so high that your profit is often low. So for example, by the time my business was starting to succeed, I'd be taking 120 grand a year in payments, but my profit would only be 20 grand because my costs were like 100 grand. But the card payment people will have had 1 to 2% of the 120 grand before I got the profit that I was able to pay. And I was like, I'm not happy about this.
I don't blame you. Because these guys are really, they're the mafia. They're the modern day mafia. The banks are, like you said earlier, it used to be that you could get really good interest. You could go to the post office. I was taught this when I was young. We're all kind of groomed into this system. Oh, look, you can go and you put your postal order that your nan's given you or whatever into the post office, and Bob's your uncle. You're slowly gaining interest, and that's how money works. And then by the time we've grown up, it's like no one will borrow to you. The interest rates are flat, and there's a crisis all around. So what was the I mean, you learn about the history of money. And what did that lead you to? Where did that lead you? Where's your first steps into this new world?
Well, some of them I've already mentioned. So there were a number of elements. So, learning how, this 1 to 2%, which you don't think is much, but when you really start to analyze it, you're like, hang on a minute, that's a big slice of my business, and all they're doing is processing the payment. And then towards the end of me running my business, I was getting more and more paperwork to have to fill in order to accept these payments and guarantees that I had to make, because of course one of the problems with digital payments with cards is fraud. So my perspective was very much not from necessarily a personal point of view, but from a business point of view. Mm-hmm. The other issue I had was that there were occasions where suddenly the banks would stop working. There'd be some kind of internet outage. So normally what would happen is I'd collect a payment from my patient with using my card machine, and then I'd actually get the payment in my bank 3 to 4 days later. But when the bank started having some of these issues, I mean, it was a few years ago now, but the bank started having some of these issues where, their payments weren't processing properly. And what would happen is those payments wouldn't come through for 7 days. Now, as I've already told you, there were 3 days early in my business where if I hadn't got the money like 3 to 4 days later from that payment, I would have been bankrupt. So just the bank delaying that payment for 7 days could have huge implications for me personally.
And had for other people. Yeah,
exactly. And you'd also hear these stories of, business owners who'd taken out loans from the bank, and then all of a sudden in 2008, they were being asked to pay these loans back overnight when they thought they had a certain amount of time. Now that didn't happen to me, but it's something that kind of occurs in the small print. And I think it was particularly Royal Bank of Scotland or NatWest who were having these problems. And there were a number of business owners who lost their business overnight just because the banks did that. And so it was a number of factors, really. It wasn't just one thing. You kind of look at these things and you just kind of think, why is that happening? And that's so unfair. I mean, I remember there was a story that just gave me nightmares around 2008. There was this guy who had this beautiful house, a wife and a daughter. And basically, I think the bank had called in some loans, and he was so desperate. He went out, he had a gun in the house. He went out, he shot the horse, he shot his wife and his daughter, and then he set the whole place on fire and then shot himself. Yeah. And I was just like, that's heartbreaking, and the fact that some people can kind of find themselves in that situation, when they've done everything right, and then at the last minute the bank can pull the rug out from under their feet and leave them so emotionally desperate. It's just heartbreaking. And so it was like a coalescence of these stories, and as a business owner, I started to realize how desperate, how easily the bank could ruin my life, how dependent my business was. I mean, one of the biggest nightmares when I was running this business, and I'd be doing really complicated clinical things on a patient, and then my nurse would come in and go, the card machine's not working. It's like,
yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah, so and it's just like it was always the bank that was like the biggest stress in my entire business. And so by then I was already studying like the whole gold and silver thing. But I was just like, okay, I get why they're sound money and why the world's economy would work better with gold and silver, but it's impractical. And the only reason we've now got a situation where we've kind of got banknotes is because we had to delegate the holding of gold and silver to the banks because it was inconvenient to transact with. And so even though people talk about going back to a gold and silver standard in terms of finance, you always need an intermediary if you're going to have that kind of financial system. And it's because we learnt to trust the banks. For 50 years in Europe, end of the 1800s, Europe was operating on a gold standard. And even though there were some disadvantages, it was one of the most prosperous eras of our history, and a lot of business development was going on. It's because we had a form of money that would hold its value, because that's what enabled businesses to kind of grow and prosper. And once they broke, once the banks started manipulating that, and that started around the First World War, that was the very beginning of it. the corruption of our money is actually partly, it's complicated to explain, but it's partly what's leading to the corruption of our society. And so even though I realized that, gold and silver would be better as a sound form of money, it was really inconvenient and we needed a digital solution. And so I was like, well, someone must have invented something along those lines. And of course, once you start looking into it, you realize that actually this has been a mission for a long period of time. So in the 90s and the early 2000s, there were a lot of people experimenting with digital currencies. There was one called eGold, which was based on, using a digital token to kind of mirror what gold did. But the problem with all of these companies was that they were owned by an individual. And of course, the moment someone's setting up a new form of money, I mean, that's technically illegal in the United States. Anytime anyone tried to do anything like that, they'd get shut down by the government. And a lot of these digital projects ended up getting shut down as soon as they started to take off and started to be successful. While they weren't doing anything, the government didn't take any notice. But the moment they started to become successful, zeroed in on them, end of project. And so the thing about Bitcoin was the person who invented it, having seen all of this, kept themselves anonymous. And they designed it in such a way that it was decentralized. So there was no central figure. There was no one who could shut it down. It was designed as an ecosystem that would kind of manage itself. And it was designed into the software. And that's one of the reasons why Bitcoin has been so successful, because all other digital projects up until this point, the US government could come in and shut it down. But with Bitcoin, they weren't able to. And actually, if you've been around long enough and you remember the early stories of Bitcoin, that in the early days, there were quite a few stories of people they thought was Satoshi Nakamoto, that, they'd invaded their house in Australia, or they'd invaded someone in the US. I mean, there was this poor engineer, with glasses who, looked like he'd kind of been working in the basement for a number of years, who had the name Satoshi Nakamoto, and they went to town on him. And so, you can observe these stories, they really tried to find the person who'd invented this Bitcoin thing, but they weren't able to, because the person who did design it was clever enough to make sure that no one would know who he was. And he hid his email address and no one could track it back to him. It's almost like he'd seen all of these projects and how they'd ended, that he deliberately made sure that he was kept anonymous so he could never be targeted.
You have to admit that comes from being really what they would describe today as a conspiracy theorist. You have to be understanding of conspiracy and how the government will crack down on anything that will change to be able anything that will bring change to be able to bring change. You have to understand that paradigm, and so you have to make that's an amazing story, isn't it? That's something very special, because it shows that if you keep something going that's decentralized for long enough without the government being able to stop it in any way or be able to shut you down, eventually it takes a life of its own, and it takes on a type of security that comes with age and maturity, I suppose, of the product itself. And the product here we're talking about, of course, is Bitcoin, which a lot of people still go cockeyed at when they try and understand what it is. So where was your journey into understanding what Bitcoin was?
Well, for me, once I understood, so all digital currencies are based on a software protocol, and all software is a set of rules that have been designed by the software engineer that designed it. So with Bitcoin, how it started was with a white paper that was only 9 pages long. And a number of the ideas had already been experimented with, but the uniqueness of Bitcoin was it kind of coalesced a number of these ideas to kind of create something that, was kind of self-governing, really. And it was governed by the software. So the idea was, once you'd kind of written the rules into the software, they couldn't be changed. And also it was set up in such a way that it wasn't impossible to change something, but you needed a strong consensus in order to be able to do it. So basically, the bigger Bitcoin gets, the harder it is to change, because you need a number of people voting. A change needs to be proposed, and you need a number of people to agree to change it for that change to be made. And so what happens is it kind of becomes more secure over time, because it's harder and harder to change it. And so people are able to trust it because they understand what the basic principles are, and it's only going to change if there's a really, really strong need to do so. So each digital currency is basically a set of rules that has been written by someone. And so if you think about it, our existing political system is based on, our politicians are basically voted in order to manage how our rules are set and how the world should work. And because our financial system has, once the banks weren't solely in charge of accounting for how much gold they had in their vaults to manage against the amount of paper that was in society, once those rules were broken, governments had to step in to manage exactly how the money was going to work, and they needed a set of rules in order to do that. But the trouble with politicians making the rules is that they can kind of change them on a whim, and only a few people can change the rules rather than a large majority of people changing the rules. I mean, supposedly we live in a democracy where the majority will vote people in and that will change the rules, but it doesn't work like that. What we're voting for is individuals that we trust to make sure they make good rules, but half the time it's difficult to vote for someone who will stay honorable once they're in office. And if they're compromised and will change the rules the way someone who is more powerful wants them to.
This is something I've looked at recently when I was my last article was on D.E. Shaw and the rise of Jeff Bezos, and the real rise of Jeff Bezos, because of course he was given a mythos, he was selling books out of his mum and dad's station wagon, and that's how he created Amazon, when in actual fact he was vice president of one of the biggest hedge funds in the world, D.E. Shaw, which owned 5% or had 5 at the peak 5% of the New York Stock Exchange. A massive figure David Shaw is in economics, and he actually, before Bill Clinton went into the White House, he was writing economic white papers for the future Clinton administration. And where you say, and when you said the Bitcoin white paper was 9 pages long, well, the white papers written by people like David Shaw are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pages long when you collect them all up. And what you have is then you have someone who's involved in this system that already works a certain way, who's trying to influence the politicians to keep everything the way that best suits them, not suits the people underneath them. And of course, that manipulation goes through when Bill Clinton got into office. David Shaw becomes one of his main advisors for the Department of Commerce, and is writing up more and more white papers and advising more and more on how to make things so that it suits them, not suits everybody else, so it suits them. And that's what a lot of people don't understand about politics, is that it's about them making the current system play well for them, not creating a new system, not ironing out the problems for the people underneath.
Yeah. And of course, the more rules you make, the more complicated it is. So, and it's just hard for people to keep up, so and this is kind of what we call the social contract. We kind of have this democratic system, and we elect the MPs, and the social contract is that, these people will work in order to serve us and make sure that society is working the best way possible. But of course, when you've got all of these behind the scenes influences, that social contract is constantly being undermined to such an extent that many people would argue that it's now broken.
Years ago, years and years ago. I try and follow this. I try and understand it, because me myself, I barely got a qualification under my belt, and everything I've learned, I've had to learn by going and look for myself, because they won't teach you this stuff, most of this stuff in school, and they won't teach you what is unfair in the universities and stuff. They'll often teach you the basics, the standards, and then it is up to you. It is your own responsibility to really go out there and find out what is really going on, because it's all of these different, even education is often a method of pulling the wool over people's eyes, rather than
absolutely,
rather than introducing them to a new world, or trying to make something constructive that works. And I mean, we'll get on to more of this soon, but continue about your journey, because I'm finding it very intriguing at the moment.
Well, I mean, going on to education and how it misguides you. I mean, I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and some of the things she tells me coming back from school. I mean, she came back one day with this picture of her and her school friends holding this piece of rock, and someone had visited the school and told her it was a moon rock. And I was like, Bethany, how do you know it's a moon rock?
It's hard, isn't it?
But the thing is, the kids are so impressionable, and unless someone's kind of giving them the alternative perspective, she was ready to bite hook, line and sinker. And she was like, oh mom, you just kind of question everything. And it was just like, no, seriously, how do you know it's a moon rock apart from the fact that this person told you? And I suppose I'm kind of doing for her what my mother did for me, which is like, question your assumptions. Just because someone tells you that.
Good stuff, really needed, because I mean, I'm talking to adults. I talk with everybody on when I'm on Twitter, and like, if someone says something to me, I have a conversation with them. And sometimes people spout some really just nonsense, where it's just what they've nearly every single time, when you investigate it fully, when you look at it fully, they've not done their own research, they've not asked the questions, they've not gone through reason and logic to come to their conclusions. Instead, this guy even said it. One guy yesterday said, I'm not going to dismiss what I learned in school because that was true. And my thought is, what leads you to trust the people who, while you're in school, you often hate the teachers, you don't like them, you don't understand why they're doing the job, you don't understand why they're teaching you this stuff. And when I was about 5 or 6, this is one of the earliest memories of school. We were told by Mrs. Moxon, I think her name was, in class 2 of St. Monica's Primary School, which is now a Muslim school, but probably teaches roughly the same curriculum. We were told that we would no longer be learning about ancient British history. We would no longer be learning about Rome. We'd no longer be learning about Greece and stuff like that. That they were going to teach us stuff about the kings and queens of England and Welsh history that's convenient for them to tell, not the inconvenient, and World War. And what I realized later on is that this had been changed within the curriculums, because they don't want you learning philosophy. They don't want you thinking logically and picking up advice from people like Socrates or other like Marcus Aurelius. They don't want you taking your bird's eye view of your everyday and looking to see if you can do better. They want you to believe what they say. They want you to believe constantly throughout school. And so what I do whenever I hear someone say, oh, this is the way it is that I go to the beginning and see if this is the way it is, and nearly every single time it's just not the way it is. And when you research the truth and you're able to explain to people why this process has led them to believe this, but it is illogical, and they look at it and go, oh god, that makes sense. You get called usually a conspiracy theorist and the like if you don't do it well enough. In my case, we make sure we dot the T's, we have all the sourced information, so they don't actually even mention our names. They don't even attack us. They fear the truth. They fear honesty. They fear sources. They fear you going back and having given a logical way of thinking and being told by people like me and other people on the independent media, question everything. Don't just believe that if someone hands you a moon rock and says it's moon rock, that you believe it's moon rock, because it's probably not moon rock. And that is a wonderful, it's fundamental. But I find I'm me and my partner, I think we're gonna be heading towards homeschooling. And we're looking around and seeing that, like with the alternative financial solutions, there are a lot of people who are building an alternative educational solutions nowadays. So there's a lot of resources out there to help people with homeschooling and with getting people out of this system. It would have been, I think that would have been impossible to do even only 10, 15 years ago. It would have been impossible to really get so many resources about homeschooling, especially the internet's only at its real birth. Now is a change, and this is like in a sense that's a form of technology. That's a new technology happening that allows us to fundamentally change the generation before and give them a generation ahead of us and give them some form of ability to reason and logic. And reason and logic is obvious. So you found Bitcoin to be the logical solution.
Well, just finishing off on just commenting on your point, I think these solutions are great. It's a little bit like the NHS doesn't work, so we'll create a private system. It's like traditional schooling doesn't work, so we'll create an alternative system. And while those things are great, one of the things it does foster is conflict. One of the things I've said to my daughter is, I said to her, I'm telling you now, Bethany, most of the things they will teach you at school is nonsense. The only reason I encourage you to go is because you need to understand how the rest of the world thinks the world works. And then my job at home is to maybe challenge some of the things that she thinks, because actually sometimes it's being exposed to the nonsense gives you the opportunity to have the conversation, to kind of go, do you think that's really true? Is there another way you can think about this? So I would never write off the existing systems altogether, because in many respects they provide an interesting contrast. And if you know what's going on and you have the resources and the ability to kind of question it, it becomes an extra layer of education yourself. And also you're not handicapping your children by not giving them any exposure to the craziness that everyone else is exposed to as well. Because even if you school them at home, they're going to come across people who've been schooled in the traditional way themselves. And of course, you then make them a target. It's like, well, you're a homeschooled conspiracy theorist. What do you know? Whereas if they stay within the system and they have educated ways to kind of challenge their thinking, which gives them tools to kind of challenge the thinking of their peers, you're starting to challenge things from the ground up. You're almost re-educating your children. And it's amazing how influential peers can be. If you've got a child who's been educated strongly and knows how to challenge things calmly and politely, and if she comes home and with a picture going, oh look, thanks, I've got a moon rock, I was like, how do you know it's a moon rock? And she then goes back to school and goes, well, how do you know it's a moon rock? You're helping them build resilience. And I've got a great example of this, because when I was at school for 3 years, I went to a boarding school. And it was in the 80s. And of course, at the time, nuclear war was the big scary thing. And all of my friends believed that one nuclear bomb could destroy the world. And there was a documentary when I was about 9 about nuclear war. And it looked quite interesting. And but it was on after the 9 o'clock watershed. And I begged my granddad to let me stay up and watch it. Anyway, this program absolutely terrified me. I remember going up to my bedroom, looking out the window and just praying like like nothing else, going, please God, don't let me die in a nuclear war. It's like the most terrifying thing ever. And so in order to calm me down, my parents and my grandparents were kind of saying, well, it's really bad, but one bomb won't destroy the whole world. My grandma explained it to me, well, one nuclear bomb might, because it might set off other people detonating nuclear bombs, but just one on its own is not going to destroy the whole world. And so when I went back to school, my friends were still on this bandwagon of one nuclear bomb could destroy the whole world. And I said, no, it can't. This is what my family said. But they really tried to convince me. And it was only a number of years later, they told me that they'd gone to one of the sixth formers and said, is it true that, one nuclear bomb can destroy the whole world? And the sixth former said, no, it's not true. But they decided to keep the narrative just to keep distressing me. But because I had the different perspective from my parents and grandparents, that's what I believed in. So, by putting kids in that situation, it seems hard on them, but you're building their resilience, and you're teaching them how to trust in their own perceptions. And who to believe. Do they want to believe their family, or do they want to believe their peers, or do they want to believe their teachers? And it's being exposed to these contrasting points of view that I think is as much a part of their education than just the information they're given.
Yeah, maybe I'm accepting that that's good. That's a good argument towards why traditional schooling needs to have some form of impact on a kid's life. One thing that I seen recently, which I wish we had all seen much before, a lot longer before, is the actual amount of nuclear bombs that have already been dropped. Lots of people don't know, but if you put in simulation, nuclear war simulation, of bombs that have been dropped, actual nuclear bombs being dropped throughout history, you discover that after the first Nagasaki and Hiroshima atomic bombs, that it's over 2,000.
Wow.
Yes, I know. It's amazing. And you get to see these little blips happen as it ticks through the years, these little blips all over the world happening. And while you're having that conversation, already in the 80s, already 1,500 nukes had gone off in the world. So the idea that it would destroy the world is obviously still goes back to the time of which I've researched heavily for my second article on the Schwab series, was Dr. Klaus Schwab, or how the CFR taught me to stop worrying and love the bomb. And it's really about how his mentors were included Kissinger and Herman Kahn, who were two of the biggest proponents of nuclear theory. Herman Kahn writing on thermonuclear war in 1961, and Henry Kissinger writing nuclear war and foreign policy in 57, I think it was. Even from that period, from the early 60s, they realized, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to happen, because it's for every one person trying to push down the button, there's never 14 hands lifting up that finger, and it's mutually assured destruction for the big bombs. But what they did want is limited nuclear warfare, a kinder nuclear warfare. And it's really important to teach, but this conflict between the past paradigms of education, finance, business, all of these, and the modern day, there's always gonna be this crossover period. So is that what we're experiencing? Is that what you started? Did you start off at this crossover period? Do you think that Bitcoin and these sort of cryptocurrency and assets in this sense are a way of are the future?
I think the way I would summarize it, going back to my religious background, there's a line in the Bible that says money is the root of all evil. Now you get some American gurus who will say it doesn't say that in the Bible. It says love of money is the root of all evil. But actually, when you really start to investigate it and you realize how our existing monetary system has become corrupted and the effect that has, what that has led is to governments having too much power, creating rules that often contradict each other and make our lives more difficult. It means that we've got a set of rules with our finances that are constantly being changed behind the scenes. So we haven't got a stable foundation. The way I talk to people about it is the fact that it's like our money, it's like a beautiful rose garden often needs a trellis for the roses to grow on. You need some kind of structure, and human beings are incredibly creative like a rose, but it's like having a sound structure where the rules can't be broken is hugely important, because if you have ability, you know what the structure is, there are amazing things that you can create. But if you don't have that sound structure, or that structure is constantly being messed with behind the scenes, as soon as you start to create something, your creation gets destroyed before it's even begun, because what you thought was a solid structure isn't a solid structure, and it completely takes the rug out from under your feet every single time. Now, some people who understand that, and they understand how the structure works, and they make the structure work for them, obviously can do well. But often it's the people who are corrupt who will do that, because most people are just trying to manage their lives honestly. They don't have the additional capacity to kind of factor in the fact that there's all this corruption behind the scenes that they've kind of got to overcome in order to make progress. And so, it's just like humanity's withering on the vine from lack of this strong, solid structure. And so, you know, I love Bitcoin because I do think humanity's been given an opportunity to have this structure. But like many things in life that started off as a good thing, a little bit like the NHS, the danger is of it becoming corrupted. You know, often the most dangerous things that have happened in our lives is because it was something good that ended up being used for destructive reasons. So, for example, you know, Einstein, when he invented the theory of relativity and started off being, you know, an idea to try and help humanity, you know, manage its energy, you know, for its creation. But then, of course, someone comes along and uses it for a nuclear bomb. So, you know, everything has its good side and its bad side. And, you know, one of the difficulties with Bitcoin is, you know, it's like this, it's like Prometheus gave humanity fire, which is like Bitcoin. Everyone went and of course, because it's so valuable and people have the ability to do such great things with it, instantly everyone wants to have the better fire. It's just like, no, I've got better fire, you know, my flame burns blue, my flame burns pink, you know, and they may advertise that they've got better features or better products, but ultimately, you know, that maybe they detract from what Bitcoin is, or they're trying to introduce something that doesn't, you know, help what Bitcoin's trying to do. And so, you know, this Bitcoin has spawned a number of other cryptocurrencies, and there's a lot of debate in the environment of the fact that, well, what happens if something better than Bitcoin comes along and we've all built our financial system on Bitcoin, or what if Ethereum's better, or what if this other cryptocurrency is better? And then, of course, you've got people talking about CBDCs, you know, central bank digital currencies, you know. So you've got the central bank, you know, initially, I think after they couldn't find who Satoshi Nakamoto was, so they had to give up on that. Their next line of attack was to discredit what Bitcoin was. So around 2016, 2017, the narrative was blockchain, not Bitcoin. And that's where a lot of these alternative currencies really started to take off. And of course, a lot of people in the Bitcoin community have started pointing out that the fact that, you know, each different cryptocurrency is essentially just a different set of rules. So it's like different governments. It's like you could say Bitcoin is like the US government, and Ethereum is like the British government, and, you know, Digibyte is like, you know, the European government or whatever. It's like different rules that have been programmed into the software. And so essentially what's going on at the moment is people are voting with their own resources as to which one they like better. You know, once they start to look into the, you know, each cryptocurrency has its own economic system, and you need to understand how the technology works to see what those differences are. And once you understand what the differences are, you can then vote with your resources as to which one you think is better. So at the moment, because Bitcoin is based around the economic principles of gold, you know, it's attracted a lot of the libertarian factor, people who believe that, you know, we should be back on a gold standard in order for the monetary system to work properly. So that's one of the reasons why it has the most value. But something like Ethereum, it's programmed differently, and it, in many of the features of its software, dilutes some of the decentralizing factors of Bitcoin. And so people are saying that something like Ethereum is more of a mirror of the fiat system. And so because people are familiar with the fiat system, they think that, you know, Ethereum will be the one that kind of takes over rather than Bitcoin, because gold didn't work, without understanding why gold didn't work in the first place. So the debate, I find, is really fascinating. It's really easy to kind of be blindsided by the discussion because there are so many different elements of it, and you can have a whole interview just arguing one particular feature, and I've watched dozens of these interviews. But it's one of the reasons why people find it so confusing, because you need to understand finance, you need to understand financial history, you need to understand how politics works, how politics is tied into our existing financial system, you need to understand how software works. So it is quite difficult to get your head around. And because it's difficult to get your head around, it's very easy for people to kind of be put off and to feel fearful of it, because these things will create a big change. You know, we've lived in what's called a fiat currency system for over 100 years. There are, you know, America finally came off the gold standard in 1971. So anyone younger than 50 has spent their entire lives trying to figure out how to run their lives based on how the existing monetary system works. And something like Bitcoin completely flips all of the rules of the game on its head, which will have profound implications for how our world works going forward if it takes off as a new form of money, which is what a lot of people are advocating. So it's a scary thing.
Well, what there's is, I mean, I going back to the start of what you were saying there, I do believe that nearly everything that gets created becomes corrupted once humans are involved. So what was really interesting about Bitcoin, and what is a selling point, at least for me and my not so optimistic views, my pessimistic views on these sort of things, is that it was set up to not be able to be influenced by the people who become corrupt eventually. Instead, it spawned a load of other ideas, cryptocurrencies that have kept within it that ability to become corrupt, or to be influenced by the corrupt eventually. And CBDCs, I see as something that is built by the corrupt at the start, so can only be corrupted and manipulated. I mean, the thoughts that come out of there, the ideas that come out of CBDC, stuff like your money or your finances, your digital money will have an expiry date. That's sickening. That's a horrible idea. You know, what they're trying to create is a dystopian version of what cryptocurrency is to most people without being educated, because
absolutely
there's so much to be said for things becoming corrupt to go, and it's very interesting that Bitcoin itself seems so solid, and so many people. I mean, I've been talking recently over the messages with a guy called Marty Bent, who's big on the crypto scene. Bitcoin magazine actually got my partner to write an article recently, and they were very nice to her, very nice guys. They were very pleasant to work with, and everybody in that seems so, who was educated on it, seems so sure that it's the future. That scares me a little bit, because I never trust humans who are so sure about it being a moon rock. You know, you get told something and you completely believe it. But I can see that the origins of this is something where someone created a system that was so impossible to manipulate, or almost impossible to manipulate. Now, when we go back to 1971 and the coming off the gold standard and etc., I think that was Kissinger too. You know, the introduction of petrodollar and stuff, that was also Kissinger, and that bought them time for a certain amount of time. But that time is coming to an end right now, and it was always going to be a generational. And there's, 40 odd years is roughly the turn of the dials in these sort of like big changes within history, and the cycles that we see repeating. And I do like the selling point that people have for Bitcoin. Like I say, you've managed to explain it to me better than most people have managed to explain it to me.
Oh, thank you.
Well, no, it's extremely useful, and it's going to be extremely useful for people watching to understand how you come to that understanding, because a lot of people just say this is the way it is and believe it, whatever. You know, the only thing that I worry is not about the competitions of things like other cryptocurrencies or CBDCs. What I worry about is the change in computer processing power undermining this. So they're at the moment they're heading towards quantum enabled computers, and that's different from fully quantum computing. If we want fully quantum computing, I don't think anything would work against it anymore, because we're talking about it being unexplainable to us, even, not understandable. So it probably wouldn't, a lot of it could undermine almost any system. But do you think that if it ends up being Bitcoin at the head of the cryptocurrencies against these CBDCs that are the next stage, really, that the banks are going to try and introduce. Where do you think there's going to be the clash? Do you think there'll be a point where there has to be all-out financial war between these two sort of big ideological sort of paradigm shifting technologies?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think you bring up an interesting point about these people who are really, really sure about Bitcoin, because you're right. I think that the technology is secure, but what they're not factoring in is humanity, because ultimately humanity is being given a choice, which is why education is so important and interviews like this are so important, because it's easy to be blindsided by it. And considering human beings have been so trained to believe what the government says and take it as fact, the danger is that, you know, CBDCs finally get to a stage where they've got the technology sorted, the governments come out and say, right folks, this is what we're going to use now, and everyone accepts it, not knowing that they had another choice. And that is the danger, because, you know, governments do have more resources, they have more power. You know, up until the pandemic, I think the pandemic has done a lot to kind of really disrupt how people see governments and to encourage them to think for themselves. But, you know, there's still a scary amount of people who are still believing the narrative of what that was all about and not even beginning to investigate what really happened and what's really going on. And so it's going to be an interesting test. I don't think there's any guarantee that Bitcoin will take over, because it depends what we choose. You know, we're being given the opportunity. The technology is out there, but if everyone just accepts what the government says and just accepts the CBDCs, that will be the system that takes over. There needs to be enough people who understand that they have an alternative choice, and there need to be enough people who've worked on the technology and have got it operational enough that it's in a position to compete with these CBDCs, because both the CBDCs and Bitcoin have a long way to go before they're really up to speed in terms of being a payment system. Lots of progress is being made. There's lots of people focusing on it, but they're not quite ready yet. So this battle is on the horizon. And so one of the reasons why I wrote my book and I come to these interviews is because I want to help people understand they have a choice. I don't take responsibility for the choice they make, but what I feel is I understand these things and I'm able to share that information. And then at the end of the day, it's up to you. So yeah, Johnny, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. And
yeah, well, it explains a lot to me about why I'm seeing the sort of rhetoric on both sides being used at the moment. Because where you say the war is coming, I think the war is here, and we're on the front lines of it now. We're seeing the frontline battles. There's a lot of talk about how 2023 is going to be the year as the central bank digital currencies starting to be rolled out, maybe in just marketing terms, being heavily marketed to people, the beginning of some form of changeover. There's been reports that the CBDCs can run on the current financial systems quite well. So obviously we're entering into a time where people feel really passionate about this stuff, and I can understand. Listen, you've given me
choice.
You've given me masses of your time today, and I thank you so much for having a conversation about this and making me understand a lot of the arguments without necessarily trying to sell things to me, which is, I find a lot of the time people come with their understanding of Bitcoin, they're well ahead of everybody, and they kind of like they're above. They feel like they're above people's intelligence, so that they can just say, "Listen, just do it. You got just listen."
Here's a moon rock.
Yeah, and it's not something. It is going to be a slow process to try and make everybody understand what the differences are between different currencies as well. And at the moment, I mean, a lot of people find it easier to use things like Ethereum, but they don't want to keep their funds in Ethereum or any of the ERC20 coins. They want to take them out of there and put them into somewhere safe, and that always seems to be like Bitcoin. So the stability of it is something very important. Like I say, thank you, Victoria, for coming on and speaking. And is there anything else? Can you tell people where they can find your work then?
Yes, certainly. Well, thank you very much. Likewise, for sharing your time and taking an interest in what I have to say and giving me an opportunity to say it. Like I say, I've got my book, Truth Decay, How Bitcoin Fixes This. It's just behind me here. That's available on Amazon. It's also available on my website if you already into Bitcoin and want to pay in Bitcoin for it. The website is satoshispage.com. I've got a newsletter on there, and I've also got a YouTube channel, very small at the moment. I'm just kind of putting my information out there for anyone who finds it useful, but maybe produce a newsletter once every 3 months on something that I feel I have a need to say, because there are lots of platforms out there, and lots of people trying to explain it, but I think everyone has a slightly different take, and different people will respond to different educators. So I'm just one of many. There are lots of resources out there, but if you're more interested in what I have to say, that's the best place to find me, satoshispage.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, and I wish you all the best in the future. And every now and again, when I'm not sure about something, I may come to you and I may write you a little message and say, "Oh my God, what is this and what is happening in the world?"
But the world's about to end.
Isn't it always? Isn't it always? Thank you for coming on, and thank you for everybody for watching and listening. I'll see you again. Goodbye.
Young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina, and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets.